Wedding Bells Ahead by Arletta Richardson. Chapter 11. Jerome Grayson Gets a Surprise. "I don't know what I expected, but it wasn't that," I said to Len after Jerome had left and Augusta had gone to her room. "Did it sound to you as though she might consider contesting the will?" "It's hard to tell what she may have in mind to do about it," Len replied. "This has been a pretty big shock. She probably doesn't know herself." But it was obvious the next morning that Augusta did have a plan. When I inquired, she replied that she had slept well and would go about her daily duties as usual. No, she wasn't worried about her future. Mr. Grayson would return this afternoon, and she intended to instruct him as to her wishes in the matter. I left for school with no idea what her wishes might be. I remembered her emphatic statement to Jerome that there would be a Harris on the land as long as she lived, and Augusta did not change her mind easily. Jerome met me on the road after school was dismissed, and we walked toward home together. "Miss Harris wanted both you and Len to be there when we discussed this matter today," he explained. "Len is already there doing some work for her." "Have you any idea what she might be planning?" I asked. Jerome shook his head. "Not a clue. I'm not even sure she knows the extent of her holdings, but I do know that she feels strongly about family ties to the land." He glanced at me. "I know what you and Len believe, but I wouldn't place great odds on that outcome. People tend to temper their ideals when large amounts of money are involved." I wanted to tell him that Christian attitudes went deeper than mere ideals, but I didn't know how to explain it. Len waved as we neared the house, and Augusta greeted us cheerfully at the door. She had prepared tea and hot gingerbread, and the kitchen was warm and cozy on a nippy November afternoon. "Len has been mulching my trees and bushes," Augusta said. "Wouldn't be surprised if it snowed any day now. Can't remember when we've had such an early fall." She looked around the table at each of us. "Guess you aren't interested in talking about the weather, are you?" "You haven't had much time to make up your mind," Jerome said. "Considering the number of years that have already gone by, a few more days won't make a difference." "Don't need more time," Augusta replied. "My mind was made up last night. Mr. Grayson, I want you to draw up whatever papers are necessary to transfer the Harris property to Frank Gage." Jerome cleared his throat. "Miss Harris, are you aware of the magnitude of the area this deed encompasses? Even if it were all farmland, it would be of great value, but considering the worth of the timber, you are probably in possession of the richest acres in this part of Michigan. I would advise you to act with great restraint." "There could be a pot of gold under every tree, and it still wouldn't be mine," Augusta snapped. "I fail to see what the value of the place has to do with its rightful disposition." "You did ask me to represent you," Jerome replied. "I'd be remiss if I didn't present every side of this issue before you make a final decision. Have you considered what your options will be if Mr. Gage asks you to move to another location? Remember, too, that you are a very independent lady. How will you adjust to reliance upon the Gage family for your livelihood?" Augusta looked surprised. "Mr. Grayson, my reliance is totally upon the Lord. However he chooses to take care of me is acceptable." She looked down at her hands folded in her lap. "I'll admit that it would be difficult to give up my home. I was born here and expected to die here." She thrust out her chin defiantly. "But I'm not so attached to any earthly things that I couldn't live without it. As to the monetary value of the land, what would I do with more than I have? No, Mr. Grayson, I thank you for your concern, but my mind is made up. We'll abide by John's wishes." Jerome looked as though he would like to argue the point further, but he said no more. Augusta turned to Len. "How does the holly look, Len? I'd like to have lots of it to decorate the church for Christmas." "It's thick," Len replied. "The berries are beginning to get red. They should be just right by December. There's enough for Mabel to use at the school for the pageant, too." "Good," Augusta said. "That should be an interesting program. Imagine 100 years of school in the same spot. That first building went up 2 years after my grandfather arrived here. Only the Elliots, the Gages, and the Harrises were there then. Don't think the Williams family arrived until 1800-something. My father said they had kitchen schools until there were too many children to crowd together." I thought about the huge kitchen at the Gages with the fireplace big enough to stand in. Augusta continued. The Gages had the biggest place, and that was the last home school. They considered naming the new one after the family, but old Mr. Gage said no, it should be called by the county name. That held until more schools were built, and then it took the branch name, the North Branch of the Chippewa River. Jerome Grayson had been taking all this in silently, obviously wondering how Augusta could reminisce about community history when she was about to sign away a fortune. Finally, he rose and reached for his hat. If this is your final consideration, Miss Harris, I'll prepare the necessary papers for you and Mr. Gage to sign. You may arrange a meeting with him at your convenience. Never put off tomorrow what you can do today, Augusta quoted. There's no reason why we couldn't go over there tonight. Matter of fact, I told them that we'd be calling. Didn't tell them why, though. Her eyes twinkled. That will be a surprise. Jerome's look said that indeed it would, and he left, obviously puzzled by the unusual behavior of this woman. I must be going too, Len said. It's time to help Pa with the chores. Come back for supper, Augusta told him. We'll go over together. I retreated to my room to work on my lessons, but found myself staring out the window at the old well house. What a chain of events hung on a strong wind. If the Gages were surprised to see all of us troop into their house, they didn't show it. We were treated warmly and led over to the chairs by the big fireplace. Grandmother Gage watched with interest as we seated ourselves and Dorcas offered us coffee.
I don't believe I know this young man, Dorcas,
old Mrs. Gage said.
Is he new in the area?
Yes, Mother, Dorcas replied. This is Jerome Grayson. He bought the old Tyler place. Mrs. Gage nodded and turned her attention to me.
I hear you and the children are looking into the history of the school. You may dig up some things that people would rather remain buried.
We aren't looking for personal items, Mrs. Gage, I replied. We just want historical facts about North Branch.
All history is personal to someone,
she remarked.
But I like what you're doing. It will be an interesting evening.
So will this one, I thought, settling back in my chair. After a few moments of conversation, Augusta turned to Frank Gage. We have some business to take care of, Frank, she said. I'll let Mr. Grayson explain it to you. Jerome produced the will, the deed, and the papers he had prepared for the transfer. When the story was told, there was silence in the kitchen. Finally, Frank spoke. Did you know that John and Marcy had married, Ma? Mrs. Gage shook her head.
No, but I'm not surprised. John asked permission to marry her the year before he left, but her pa and I thought she wasn't old enough. We told them to wait until she was 19, but John had to leave for the war. Apparently they decided to marry before he went and tell us about it when he returned.
Of course, he didn't come back, Frank put in. And Marcy died of lung fever the same winter. If it hadn't been for the storm, chances are we would have never known. We know now, Augusta said briskly. So we might as well finish up what we came to do. What did you come to do, Augusta? Frank inquired. Why, transfer the deed to you, of course, Augusta replied. The title goes to Marcy's heirs, and all of you are her family. We'll just need your signature here, Mr. Gage, Jerome said. I'll see that the papers are filed at once. Frank Gage shook his head. I don't want it. I beg your pardon? I don't want it, Frank repeated. I've no right to the Harris property. I have all the land I need, and I certainly wouldn't take Augusta's house away from her. Jerome looked bewildered, then leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. I've had to deal with people who thought they weren't getting their fair share, he said. But I've never before had anyone refuse a bequest. You understand, Mr. Gage, that the property is rightfully and lawfully yours. I understand, Frank replied. I don't think there's any law that says I have to take what I don't want, is there? Jerome admitted that there probably was not. He looked from Frank to Augusta. What do you propose to do about the will? Old Mrs. Gage chuckled.
I propose that we chuck it back under the well house and let some future generation worry about it," she suggested. "Augusta, are you going to plant another tree where that one came down?"
"I'd thought about it," Augusta said. "It looks awfully bare out there. Ma was always partial to weeping willows. Might have Hiram set one in for me." Poor Jerome sighed and lapsed into silence. After the others had visited a while longer, we rose to leave, and Jerome took Len aside. "Do you think they know what they're doing?" he asked anxiously. "I'm sure they do," Len replied. "Frank Gage is an astute businessman, and Augusta wouldn't be an easy one to fool. Yes, they've settled things to their satisfaction." "But they haven't settled anything," Jerome exclaimed. "I'm standing here with a will, a deed, and a transfer. What do we do now?" "Come, Mr. Grayson," Augusta said soothingly. "I think I have a solution that will benefit all of us. Since Frank doesn't want it, I'll sell 2 square miles of riverland to you for your lumber mill. Then I'll leave the money in my will as a trust for the children. He won't object to that, will you, Frank?" Frank grinned broadly. "Why, no, Augusta, if that's what you want to do. You don't owe me a thing, you know." "I'm not paying you anything," Augusta returned, "just trying to carry out at least part of John's wishes. His children would have inherited it if he and Marcy had lived." She turned to us. "Are we standing here in the doorway all night, or are we going home?" "Home," Len laughed, and he herded a dazed Jerome out to the buggy.
"That's nearly 1,000 acres, Augusta,"
I said to her after the men had gone on.
"That should produce a lot of lumber. What made you change your mind about selling?"
Augusta dropped into the rocker before she answered. "When I learned that none of the property was mine, I realized that there are more important things in life than just holding on to family possessions. A lumber mill will bring jobs and people to the area. Besides, I like Mr. Grayson. I like the way he does business. I want to see what the Lord can do with a young man like that." She rose and started for her room. "This has been a long day. You can sit out here if you want to. I'm going to bed." End of chapter 11.